In this presentation, I would like to take a look at the fuel tank cleaning and service procedures, and more importantly, the service of the fuel filter. So when we get to the expectations of this lab, it's important to understand there are two versions of the fuel filter set up in these engines. The older style with the non-tethered gas cap, you will notice the fuel filter is permanently built into the fuel tank. It's actually part of it. In the tethered gas cap version, which is what we are currently working on, it doesn't particularly matter the displacement, the 160 or the 190 does not really matter. The fuel filter is actually a separate piece contained within really the fuel line is actually the easy way to get to it. So we'll show you the service procedure for that, rinsing out the fuel tank in the non-tethered cap version and making sure you have flow both ways is sufficient there. So I always perform this service whenever I do any sort of work on the carburetor to make sure we're not getting any dirt and junk in that fresh carburetor rebuild. So the expectations for this lab are as follows. You need to make sure all of your oil and fuel is drained from your engine. That should have been completed during the engine start and run. There should have been a check sheet that was issued to you. In fact, there was, and you should have received the appropriate signatures as far as that is concerned. If you have not received those signatures, please make sure those are completed before proceeding with this lab, unless you have been authorized otherwise. You're going to remove the recoil starter here as shown. You're going to disconnect the fuel lines, which is pretty self-explanatory why the fuel needs to be drained. We're going to rinse out the fuel tank with a little bit of warm soapy water. We're going to ensure the fuel filter is clean. The wrap-up of this activity, your parts are organized in your storage tote. You should have a name on both sides plus the lid. You are not going to reassemble your engine, and you will make sure to obtain the appropriate signatures on your lab sheet when you're finished. Let's go ahead and get started. Next, we're going to go ahead and remove the 3 flange nuts that are holding the starter on. There's one hiding back here. You can't really see it. We'll make sure our ratchet is in lefty-loosey mode. Once those 3 have been removed, the recoil starter simply lifts off the engine. One quick precaution, sometimes this stud will continue to spin. In other words, the flange nut does not remove from it. Your best option is to continue to turn it until you can lift the front of the fan shroud from the engine. At that point in time, you can put a combination wrench on these wrench flats and separate it from the flange nut. With your recoil starter removed, the entire fan shroud will come off at this point. With that fan shroud removed, we're simply going to temporarily reinstall the flange nuts back onto the studs. And that just keeps them from getting lost. I put all 3 of them in the rear because if we put them up here on the front, we'll have to remove it again later to remove the ignition system, which will happen in a separate video. So with the fuel tank in hand, there's a couple of service precautions, or rather, don't lose your parts precautions, that I need you to be aware of. There are these little grommets, and they look like this. And they press fit into the fuel tank, or rather the fan shroud, with the wide end on the bottom. So they press up from the bottom portion of the fan shroud. There are 3 of them. You really need to make sure that they're not loose, that they don't fall out. If they do want to fall out, the easiest way I found to keep them from falling out is just put a little drop of super glue on them to hold them in place. Your next job on this is going to be, and I'm actually not going to do it because this is literally a brand new part here. We'll remove the hang tag. But you need to flush out the fuel tank with hot soapy water. And just do that in the shop. You will need your safety glasses for that activity. The fuel filter on this, the tethered gas cap style, you can see the fuel tank is a completely separate entity as far as that's concerned. That fuel filter is serviced separately from the rest of the tank. If you have the tethered, or excuse me, the non-tethered gas cap, the one that you can just take the gas cap completely off, that's not this style, that is actually included. It's kind of welded, plastic welded into this bottom portion here of the fuel tank. So what you need to do in both of these situations is you need to rinse the tank and you need to flow water into this fuel outlet in reverse to stir up any junk. Make sure you shake it really good and things like that. Give it an inspection. And lastly, dry it really well with some compressed air. So that's pretty self-explanatory exactly how to do that. I don't want any water in the fuel tank. Please do not put your fasteners in the fuel tank because there's always a little bit of moisture. They will corrode and that will damage them. When you're finished with that, please make sure you get a signature on your lab sheet. This has been a look at how to remove the fuel tank, the recoil starter, and how to service the fuel filter in your Honda GC series engine.